Hey, today I'm going to practice a talk I'm giving at the biophilosophy conference put on by the Center for Process Studies. And I'm going to just do a practice run and probably have to stop at certain points throughout to edit my slides or make a correction. And this will end up being probably a much longer version than what I will give at the conference. So here we go. It's called Ateles Entelecheia, and this is a phrase that comes from Aristotle's Physics, Book 8, when he's defining motion. But it also applies in a way to his view of life. And it means incomplete, complete actuality. So it's a kind of oxymoron, a play on words to some degree. Um, and the subtitle, A Brief History of Biophilosophy and the Metaphysics of Absence, Virtuality, and the Incompleteness of Life. And this is drawing on a book by Terence Deacon, Incomplete Nature, in which he develops this idea of absence or absential qualities. And the term virtuality comes more from Bergson and Leibniz, who I'll also be drawing on. And then, of course, the incompleteness of life is connected directly to this title. The books that are framing my thought here are probably primarily Matter and Memory by Henri Bergson, but also this book, Making Spirit Matter, which is an incredible book. I highly recommend it, by Larry Sumner McGrath, which digs into a lot of the issues I'll be talking about today, but within French spiritualism, the movement in France leading up to Henri Bergson. Next would be Cybernetics and the Origin of Information by Raymond Rouillet. And I see closely related to this ideas from this book on Aristotle called Aristotle on God's Life-Generating Power and the Pneuma as its Vehicle by Abraham P. Boss. So I will reference them throughout the talk. The primary texts I'm drawing from are Aristotle's Physics, his Metaphysics, and De Anima, primarily those three texts, and then a little bit also from Leibniz Monadology. What I'm trying to argue is that instead of interpreting Aristotle strictly through a kind of vitalist teleology, um, you know, that part exists, but it's a very limiting frame. And there's much more depth to his thought. And I think people prematurely have rejected him without fully understanding what he's really doing. And to understand what he's really doing, we should read him in light of the metaphysics of virtuality, which we could also call absential powers. And this metaphysics is born from a phenomenology, a study of what it is to be alive from the living being, and specifically a phenomenology of the temporality of development, like habit, and in thought. And as we'll see, thought and developmental processes in life aren't exactly the same for Aristotle, although they're intimately connected. So Aristotle's dynamic metaphysics solves a major problem. It solves the relation between the mind and the body, between nature and intellect. So when we look at reality in terms of power, capacity, energy, we sidestep this division between body and mind. So related to nature is kinesis, which is the Greek word for movement. Related to life is energeia, which is basically energy or enactment. And related to mind is entelecheia. And all of these three kind of interrelate, and especially because of dunamis, which means power, capacity, potential. So here's all the English terms, and then down here some of the Greek. A movement is, in a way, the dunamis and the energeia together. Nature and life and mind, there's a continuity between them because of this dynamism, and we'll dig into this more. But he says in Physics 8, the potential precedes, the literal Greek is walks towards actuality. Movement is an incomplete, complete actuality. So it's an Ateles Entelecheia. I've worked quite a bit on this topic. I just want to briefly mention my dissertation, Aristotle's Theory of Dynamics, examining the ancient Greek roots of process philosophy. In that, I go totally into this relation between Henri Bergson and Aristotle and try and say, how can we read Aristotle through a Bergsonian lens? How can we read Bergson through the influence of Aristotle? So we'll barely touch on the full complexity of that issue. It's actually highly difficult to piece together. Bergson wrote his doctoral thesis on Aristotle, but he also has various harsh critiques of Aristotle. So it really takes some pulling apart to see where they're similar and where they diverge. And if you're interested, go read that. I also have a number of peer-reviewed article journals on these topics as well. So this is a topic I've been working on for a long time and kind of synthesizes a lot of my research. So virtuality, absential qualities, incompleteness, these are the main themes of my talk. And I really think that this theme as a whole has been most like taken forward the furthest by Henri Bergson in Matter and Memory with his notion of pure memory. And I will dig into that a little bit more. But what we're going to see is that pure memory is very similar to Aristotelian entelecheia. And the way that pure memory as virtuality and entelecheia as virtuality match up within their systems gives us a kind of point from which to track this evolution of biophilosophy. So there are precursors to Aristotle. I should just mention that the idea of entelecheia and energeia is these kind of gathering activities that bring together a multiplicity and organize them in the way that form does. So Pythagorean attunement or harmonia had already done this. The Heraclitean logos does this in a way, and there's a hidden logos, right? So that would be an absential logos. And in Plato, and especially in the Sophist, the idea of dunamis is taken up and taken very seriously as a potential leveling of all ontology, so that ontology becomes approached through power. There are modern equivalents too of these ideas found in Spinoza, like Conatus, and Leibniz, as we're going to see, but also Kant, Schelling, Nietzsche. And in contemporary philosophy, things like Merleau-Ponty's lived body, Deleuze's idea of the virtual, and we could find more, especially in Whitehead, Simondon, and I'll look at Rie. Now, of contemporary people, I think the furthest person to go in the direction of absential qualities and virtuality is Rupert Sheldrake with his idea of morphic resonance. But his views might be a bit on the idealist side, at least as compared to perhaps Aristotle and Bergson. And then we have Deakin, who I'm drawing from here, with his notion of absential qualities, but his perhaps goes a bit more in the materialist direction. So I'm trying to bring something slightly between Sheldrake and Deakin. So, what is this view? It's basically developmental ontology. And I'm taking this term from David Morris and his book, Merleau-Ponty's Developmental Ontology. But this developmental ontology of Merleau-Ponty comes from Bergson and Aristotle and others. So, what is it? Well, first of all, it's a critique of vitalism. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. You can read books on Bergson's critiques of vitalism and how he's not a vitalist. Unfortunately, Deakin lumps together the idea of the élan vital with vitalism, which is actually completely incorrect. But so there's a critique of vitalism, there's a critique of mechanism, the mechanization or automation of all living behavior and activity. And it's also a critique of presentism. And by that, we can think presence to consciousness, what can be immediately grasped in consciousness with all of its parts. So it's based on a phenomenology of developmental duration. And developmental duration has three key features, let's say. First of all, it is heterogeneity. This is a big idea for Bergson. No two moments of duration are the same. there's an arrow of time, everything fits in a certain place within history, and you can't just swap the future for the past. And every moment is utterly unique. So every moment of our past life is individual, it's singular with respect to the rest. So all duration, all experience, all life involves heterogeneity between moments. It also involves what I would call dissension in the sense of the dispersion of energy and the arrow of time. So every moment comes later than prior moments and finds its place in a certain series. You know, a certain stage of development necessarily comes after prior stages and has prior conditions as its conditions. Ascension, on the other hand, is what Merleau-Ponty would call vertical genesis. It is the gradual enrichment and expansion of power and action and organization of movement and things like that over time, right? If you practice an instrument, you gradually get better at it, and eventually you have a skill that you didn't have before. So that kind of vertical genesis. So there's preconditions, and then higher developments come from them. And also, two very important aspects of developmental ontology are, on the one hand, a kind of cybernetics, a sort of self-regulation, which historically has been understood through tension and attunement, and for Merleau-Ponty, modulation, and this idea of integration. So being able to take a multiplicity of changes and have them integrate with each other. I mean, that's what digestion is, right? All these processes going on the body, and through a sort of self-regulating organization, that food is turned into energy for the body. And something that kind of creates tension within developmental ontology, especially for a kind of pre-formist view that a lot of people find in Aristotle, that everything's working towards some perfect, already determined form. The embryonic potentiality sort of pushes back against this and says that what's really important is the pre-individual virtuality, sort of raw potentiality that, before the organism has all of its organs, it has this embryonic potential to be developed in a number of different ways in the same material. Some of it becomes a heart, some of it becomes whatever, an arm. And as we're going to see, we never leave entirely the embryonic phase behind as humans. Our brains continue to have this embryonic potential that can be developed, and we can actually literally invent new psychical faculties, as we'll see. I'm also borrowing ideas here from Veronique Fauty's article, Merleau-Ponty, Vertical Genesis and the Aristotelian Powers of the Soul. So the problems of biophilosophy are at first sort of fighting against false ideas. We need to first critique mechanism, vitalism, presentism. And once we've figured out how to avoid badly stated metaphysical and psychological problems, and this is by attaining to the absential and virtual qualities, then all of our problems will be stated in terms of power, activity, actuality, movement. And this allows us to give due to the proper qualities of life and its developmental processes, the heterogeneity, dissension, and ascension. So let me dig deep into Bergson's idea of the virtual and its sort of epistemological fallout. And then we'll go to Aristotle and really dig into his idea of entelecheia. So Bergson's virtual is all based in his view of pure memory and the past. We could say that the past exerts a force on the present. So the past, first of all, cannot, he says that it's impotent in a certain sense. It's impotent in happening again, occurring again, right? Once something has occurred, it can never be exactly as it was. That's the principle of heterogeneity. But that doesn't mean that the past doesn't influence the present and that it can't be repeated in a certain way. So the past actually is a certain power, certain force on our consciousness and on life. And memory operates in a way that is not just the recall of images. There's this virtual memory, pure memory, as he calls it, that influences our thoughts and our actions without formally becoming a representation or an image within our consciousness. So oftentimes thought occurs not, I mean, thought on the whole is not a single image. It's always a movement of interconnections between a multiplicity of images. And thought is more on the side of the cybernetic guiding, the steering. I'm using the term cybernetic in that very particular sense of steering. Kubernetes is the art of steering of a ship. So it's the movement among images, not the images themselves. And this starts to get us towards Bergson's idea of the absential side of memory and of its power through thinking. And he gives in one of his lectures at the Collège de France an example drawn from contemporary psychological studies at the time on how chess players think about how master chess players think about multiple games simultaneously. They do not represent the board to themselves in space, like where am I in the game right now? Then they would like have the image in their mind of the board. So that's not the way that they would actually think about it, even though maybe we would expect it to be something like that. No, instead, what they would imagine is a sort of dynamic system of changes and processes. And so each piece, instead of being, on the board, and then you think secondarily that piece can move like this. No, instead, you already are thinking of the movement as a dynamic action. So there's a parallel movement, there's an oblique movement, and there's like an L-shaped movement, right? And they run the whole system of movements. And at every moment, rather than thinking of a space and then how the pieces relate in space, they would think of these possibilities of the enduring and unfolding quality of the game at every moment. I could go way more in detail in this, but that's all we have time for right now. And a way to think about this is thoughts without images. So how do we think? How do we think the game? How do we think our next move in, maybe in a sport or like skiing or something like that? You don't have to represent to yourself where you're going to go next down the hill. There's this quasi thought that's not fully determined, maybe a more effervescent thought. And really, memory as a whole is this freely flowing movement from memory to memory rather than a collection of images or a catalog of images. One way to kind of get an intuitive sense of this is to think about forgetfulness. So when you want to remember a word or what topic you were just talking about in a conversation or something, all of a sudden you're like, oh, I feel drawn towards some idea, some thought, whatever the word was or whatever the topic was, but you don't know what it is. So you're not fully ignorant of it, and you also can't create a representation of it. And as you make random associations, try and recall where you were, do whatever means necessary to get to that idea, as soon as you get there, you know that it was what you were thinking about, right? So there's this in between knowing what you're thinking and not remembering at all or being completely forgetful, where we're attempting to remember something, right? So that kind of pushes us in the direction of thoughts without images. We can also look to the lived body for this, and Merleau-Ponty, the body schema. This idea really comes from Bergson to begin with, the idea of nascent movement. So nascent or latent is a movement that is beginning but isn't actualized yet. So we can feel ourselves about to move, right? And you can feel this tension growing in yourself of you're moving towards something, or I don't know if you're jumping in a pool and like you really want to jump in but you're not ready and you feel the nascent movement to jump in. So it's not something actualized, and it doesn't require that we picture in our mind that we're jumping in. It could, but it doesn't have to. um, so nascent movement, another kind of virtual quasi present aspect of our experience. And we can also think here of micro perceptions. I'm going to get into this more with Leibniz, but uh, there's this notion that gradually perceptions, small perceptions that we barely notice, start to build up, and then all of a sudden, our attention is completely taken by them. So when we turn our head to notice something, um, it could be partially taking our attention without us fully having looked at it and had it grab our attention. There's this kind of in between moment where something is gradually building up strength within our awareness to become a perception. So that's just a taste of where pure memory comes in for Bergson. Um, in his lectures on psychology at the Lycée Henri IV from 1893 to 4, he gave several um, lectures, or he gave a lecture that goes into several aspects of the unconscious, which is essential here, I think, for understanding the space between what is purely potential and what is fully actual within our consciousness. Um, and so, the unconscious, obviously, Freud, everyone thinks of. But before that, there was Pierre Genet and Henri Bergson and a number of other French spiritualists at the time who were debating the unconscious. And so Bergson gives us a run through of that and weighs in on what he thinks. And this is right before Matter and Memory. And in Matter and Memory, he actually goes a little bit further than what he says here, but I think it's really interesting. And he goes further here in certain ways as well. So the first kind of unconscious that he looks at is unconscious perceptions. And here he's thinking almost entirely through Leibniz. He says that there are perceptions, perhaps, that are too weak to become a full perception. So we slightly sense something, but it doesn't actually become fully noticeable. I don't know. You could think you turn the volume up a little bit, and it's still not making any difference. I need it to be louder, right? Then there are perceptions, or you could think imaginations, or even thoughts that are too quick. If I don't know, if I flash a light too quickly, you won't see the light at all, right? It has to be on for a certain amount of time, and they were doing experiments on this at the time. And then we can also think of those that are too confused. And the famous example here is from Leibniz. When we listen to the ocean, we hear all these waves. We can't really distinguish, one wave from another. It's all too confused and undifferentiatable. And Bergson basically says none of these are unconscious psychological states in and of themselves. It's just that in order for a psychological state to become aware, it needs to occur for long enough and strong enough and with enough detail for it to become something that we actually perceive and think and can identify. The next would be psychological automatisms. And here, the examples given are related to association. So if I hear someone speaking English, I can't help but hear it as articulated speech. And if I'm trying to sleep, for example, and I hear English versus another language that I don't know, I'm more likely to be able to kind of sleep through another language because my extra activity of interpreting it isn't kind of keeping me agitated and awake, right? So there's a kind of reflex in speech. I mean, there's these examples of, read the color and the word says yellow, but the color of the word is red. And there's a whole bunch of these, and you try and read them, and you can't keep yourself from kind of mixing up the written and the color. So that's another way of automatic recognition or mental activity, a kind of psychological automatism, something happening without our will stepping in. It's just automatic and you can't turn it off. And he gives the example, again from Leibniz, of a musical chord. When you hear a musical chord, your mind hears it as ordered in a specific way. And actually, mathematically, it has, a certain ratio to it. And you can't help but to, Leibniz says, do unconscious mathematics when you hear it. The next example is unconscious reasoning. And he gives this kind of example of you're thinking about something and all of a sudden you think this, and then all of a sudden jump to the conclusion. And it's as if you shot straight through to the insight. And in this case, thought occurs too fast for every step along the way to be known clearly. It is the case sometimes, he says, that you can go back and follow the steps and see the interconnections. But phenomenologically, it's quite different to look at each step independently on its own from what happens in thought itself. The thought is this kind of undivided movement that goes through all of these steps, and they all happen very fast. And if you want to stop at them and explain them, you have a lot of explaining to do because on their own, they don't hold up. But in the assemblage that they form together, it's a coherent thought. So phenomenologically or descriptively, we can look at this in terms of the differential calculus, the differential versus the tangent. So a differential is an infinitely small amount of change, while a tangent, touches that change on one point and is a straight line approximating the slope at that moment. If we look back at our reasoning, what we see is these tangents, but when we experience it as a continuity, they are these differentials, these inflection points within the movement. I'll come back to that example. And, some thoughts and images are fleeting and so fleeting that they don't really remain in our memory, but they still contribute to the direction of our thought, to its enrichment, to how it forms and develops, even sometimes the negatives, right? It's not this, right? At a certain moment in our thought, we think, not that thought, and keep moving that way. And the things that we kind of discard and push away might not even remain within our memory as that thought builds, even though it gives it shape and development. So we can see it's not fully conscious, but it is contributing to conscious thought. He also looks at habit, and I don't want to get too deep into that, but habit, is the repetition of action through the body or within the mind. It's a kind of automata that comes about through repetition. And he says these aren't unconscious psychological states so much as material configurations of the body. So the activity of habituation for Bergson is this vital activity that involves consciousness that can't be reduced to the body. But the contraction of habits, the fact that we have habits as preformed automata, is necessarily linked to something in the body. And things like brain lesions can disrupt our habits. He also looks at examples from hypnosis, which was very big at the time, Pierre Genet and other people like that. Even Bergson did early hypnotic research. And there we see the notion of an implanted suggestion, right? So you actually create like an unconscious self through hypnosis that then executes actions when awake, even though your waking consciousness isn't aware of it. And this was also, very influential on studies of split selves and using hypnosis to kind of split selves and create separate unconscious selves. But Bergson looks at all this and says, basically, these aren't unconscious psychological forces, but separate selves, conscious to themselves, but unconscious of each other, right? And so so we could have this kind of like dream self even. He looks at the example of, inventing something in your sleep. The next day you wake up, you invent the thing, and you think that it came just out of nowhere. But really, when you were sleeping, your conscious thought during your sleep had these ideas. And although it hasn't fully integrated with your waking self, it hasn't created a bridge so that you remember you were sleeping when you thought of it, all of a sudden it pops into your head. But it's because you had consciously thought about it during your sleep. So again, not full unconscious, just broken up consciousness into separate selves. And finally, he looks at memory. And this is the only one that he says actually constitutes something like an unconscious. So memory for Bergson is the entirety of our past. Well, ideally, we can't actually access that with our memory. Um, there is the pure past for Bergson, and then there is a memory of the past that is in its sort of, you could say, least contracted form, least funneled and shaped by our present concerns to make it more relevant or clear in the present. But all of our memories, in some sense, are constantly trying to realize themselves. Like I said, they exert a force. There's a certain latent movement to them, an infinitely small actualization. They're infinite, like an infinitesimal realization of itself into a lesser state of consciousness that will gradually become a full state of consciousness as we turn our attention to it. So when we're thinking about things in our memory, we start to move towards, when we're being forgetful or trying to think of something, or even just moving from one thought to another, you start to see a new image coming up on the horizon. It's not a fully fledged thought or image within our consciousness, but we're drawn towards it like a magnet, right? And we also feel that as we approach it, a whole new horizon of other associations start to open up. So instead of an atomistic view of association as pre-established field of interrelations, we have this virtual interconnectedness with varying degrees of vividness and concretization. And now this is an incredibly important passage. I'm not going to read the entire thing. I've kind of highlighted some things here, but I left it up there for you in case you want to, take a screenshot or whatever and read it later. But this has all of this together. And this is the section on memory that I was just referring to from this section on the unconscious. What's really important here is the connection with Aristotle. He says about the unconsciousness of our memories, the fact that they endure in a virtual state even when they're not actualized. He said is the same can be said of all potential knowledge, all knowledge possessed but not used. And this is exact verbatim language from Aristotle's De Anima, Book 2. All that is latent in intelligence and even in the mind in general. That basically here, this effort of attention is what brings the memory from its virtual state into an actual state by moving through a chain. What we do is we dissociate our current state and break down its nebulosity into an infinite multitude of clearer elements, the sheer endlessness of which was precisely what made our current state vague and nebulous. So what he's saying is that when I start to remember, a certain period of my life or things related to a certain topic, at first I have this nebulous thing. I start approaching that past in its complexity, and I start eliminating what's irrelevant to my current, inquiry into it. Why am I attending to this memory? Then those aspects of the memory start concretizing and start breaking down. And the indefinite, endless, sheer nebulosity of it, which is this virtual, gradually becomes a concretized state with an image and a sense and a movement to it. So in the flux of our awareness, there are these kind of lesser selves, lesser consciousnesses rising up on the periphery, not fully conscious, but pushing into consciousness. And he says, perhaps alongside the solidly organized consciousness of the self, we should represent scattered, isolated conscious states with a life less intense, wholly inner, waiting in a way to be assimilated and used by the primary self. And what he's saying is that basically there are these dream selves, germinal dream selves kind of popping up, and they guide and direct and enrich our thought, even though they are not clear and distinct images within our thought, and they don't necessarily even leave a trace in our memory, but they direct our thinking and give it shape. So, in summary, there are no purely unconscious psychological states, according to Bergson. There are, using a phrase from Leibniz, 1,000 nothings never make a something, right? 1,000 infinitely small consciousnesses can become fully conscious because they were already quasi-conscious, right? So unconscious is really just a sort of limit case that we never reach. We can diminish consciousness down to an almost nothing, right? A infinitely small amount of consciousness, but we cannot eliminate the consciousness within it. And another conclusion, takeaway from this is that there can be multiple centers of awareness and consciousness, and that it can bubble up gradually from a lesser consciousness with less unity to a more vivid and interconnected consciousness. And finally, there are ways of thinking that exceed representational presence, that abide in the virtuality and quasi consciousness, which he says is not unconscious, but rather hyper conscious. And here we're going to see connections with the idea of the intellect in Aristotle and Plotinus and Leibniz. So in Bergson's lectures on Plotinus at the École Normale Supérieure in 1898 to 1899, this comes after Matter and Memory. He talks about Plotinus and consciousness and the unconscious. And we see some very clear connections between his cone image and the philosophy of Plotinus. He also goes into this in the Collège de France lectures. But consciousness for Plotinus is a diminution of the intellect. It is a lessening of it. And I think the same can be said of the virtual past, the virtual pure past for Bergson. But it's a diminution from one perspective. From another perspective, from the perspective of life and soul, it is an expansion and an intensification. So thinking happens one thought at a time. It is not the interconnectedness of things. Like if I want to think about a triangle, even though a triangle, according to Plotinus, is deeply interconnected with all other ideas in geometry and even beyond geometry, when I want to think a triangle and then I want to think a parallelogram, I have to take steps. And when I get to the parallelogram, I'm thinking the triangle under the system of the parallelogram, right? And then to think a circle, I also have to go under I have to, shift from one thought to another. But within the intelligible sphere, these ideas are completely interconnected. So by thinking them, I'm diminishing their integral connection to each other. All right, so Bergson puts this all together with his famous cone diagram, which we can see here. In terms of dynamism, you start up at the top with virtuality, analogous to Entelecheia for Aristotle. In the middle, we have the activity of consciousness, like physically, or not physically, but, actualizing thought within particular thought arrangements. And then down here, we have pure actuality, we might say, which is the present, the body acting in the present. Movement. This is the plane of motion. It's the entire universe. And then the point is the body within that. Let's see. And up near the top of the cone is this area of these bubbling up germinal nascent cells. And they help influence the formation of planes of consciousness, which are degrees of tension between the present perception and our entire past. The integration of these two realities. And then the tip is the body. So the differentiation between virtual and actual from possible and the real is done by Bergson in the book Creative Mind, in the essay titled The Possible and the Real. And he criticizes the idea of the possible and differentiates it from the virtual by this exact description that I've been giving, that the virtual is this vast interconnectedness and its actualization is a diminishment of it. versus the possible and the real, where the possible is a fully formed finite reality. It's the pre-existence under the form of an idea. So we have a representation of a possible future, but we also affirm that this does not exist, right? At least in the present. So it's representational and it's based on quantity. On the other hand, the virtual and the actual, we can draw from Aristotle here as well, because his view is not that of the possible and the real. He says a given thing is capable of nothing impossible, follows from the assumption that the activity it is said to have the capacity for belongs to it. So it's a wordy formula, but it basically is exactly what Bergson says in this essay, that before Hamlet was written, was it possible? Well, there was no insurmountable obstacle to its creation. Doesn't mean that it pre-existed under the form of an idea, which was negated its existence and then had existence added to it. Instead, we should look at force and exercise, at the way that effort relates to pure memory. And all of this will remain unrepresentable. And the virtual, in its virtual force, is never a simple pre-existence of a representation of some finite reality. All right, let's dig into Bergson, and then we can come back to so let's dig into Aristotle. We can come back to Bergson to make these connections. So Aristotle's dynamic sense of being, this has been drawn out by certain commentators. More recently, Brentano and Ravesson, at least in the 19th century, and then more recently, Sentesi and Boss and a number of other authors. So the key ideas here are dunamis, energeia, and entelecheia, which translate roughly to power, activity, and actuality, although those translations are quite inadequate. And each one of these words, as we'll see, has multiple senses. So he'll say that there's a first dunamis and a second dunamis, or first entelecheia and a second entelecheia. And they actually overlap with each other too, as we'll see. Kinesis, for example, is one of these overlaps. It is what he says, it's an incomplete activity, but it's also the actuality of a dunamis. So movement is the actualization of a potential, right? So it's the bridge between entelecheia and dunamis. Another major idea, which I can barely scratch the surface of, but is so deeply important here, is that of continuity, synekes. And entelecheia and synekea are related to each other. And really, I think entelecheia should be thought of as the complete continuity, or the continuity that creates its own continuity from within itself, something like that. And that was intentional by Aristotle. The word entelecheia is a play on words from endelecheia. Instead of a tau, you have a delta. And that word means continuity. So it's a play on words with the idea of continuity, but it's the complete, full continuity. So it's an incomplete, full continuity, an oxymoron. And the really big idea that kind of pulls all this together is the idea of the pros-hen focal unity, which we could also call convergence. It is what allows a multimodal existence to have unity, that the unity cannot be present to consciousness. Okay, so what does that mean? The example he gives are health and justice. He gives the example of health in Metaphysics 4. Health is interacted with by humans in multiple ways. First of all, we're beings whose health matters to us, right? I'm a being who cares if I'm healthy or unhealthy and works to be healthy rather than unhealthy. So there's a kind of experiential side to it. Then there's also all the manifestations of health, right? We have signs of health, symptoms of sickness, right? Flush face or something like that. Then we have healthy food, things that we interact with that relate to our health in some way, right? This food will promote my health, okay? Then there are behaviors, right? Actions that relate to health. I take a walk in order to help my digestion. Beyond that, there are more. There's doctors, right? Doctors have a certain knowledge about health. That's not the same thing as healthy food, but they're all focally related to one underlying reality that is absential, that is irreducible to all the multiplicity of manifestations and interrelated phenomena. The same thing goes for justice. So there's all these ways that justice relates. There's justice, as a legal thing. There's justice within economics. There's justice as a lived activity, right? Um, and ultimately, the focal unity is the living being for whom justice is a question, right? In the way that health, what is the focal sense of health? Well, ultimately, it's the relevance of health to a being for which health is a primary of primary importance. So this idea of pros hen and health and justice, these are hexis, which is a kind of metastable active dynamism. And the hexis as a metastable active dynamism is kind of like a active habit that is intellectually rich and adaptive to different situations and things like that. It, in a sense, is the focal meaning of the dynamic sense of being. Our power, our capacity, our activity, our being at work in the world, all of these things are bringing together all the facets of our life into a metastable active dynamism that's actualizing itself in real time. Okay, to fully understand Entelecheia, I would need to go through this entire diagram, and I would need to go through all of this about Energeia as well. I'm not going to go through any of this now. I'm just going to briefly point out that the word is made up of a tele, an eke, and an n, and the ea is kind of just like makes it into a property. So having, ekein, is related to hexis. It's also related to sunekia, which is continuity, and a number of other words, periekein, katekein, and importantly here, metekein or methexis, which means participate or share in, because a focal meaning is one in which all of the multiplicity of manifestations participate in one underlying, although never fully present, existence or reality, right? The enduring person. So we could go into so much more detail here about the meaning of telos and the relation of entelecheia to motion and the differentiation between a first and a second actuality, which I'm going to get into in a minute, and the relation of entelecheia. But this is a larger project. I just want you to appreciate how complex this term is, and Aristotle actually never defines it himself. So let's take a step back and think about Aristotle's hylomorphism. I think it's one of the most important aspects of his philosophy and also one of the most misunderstood, but it is central to his dynamic sense of being. So we have matter on the one hand and form on the other. That's what hylomorphism means. And for Aristotle, there are a number of other terms that kind of fall under these categories. We have, the important thing about it is that there's a middle ground between them. That there's not just bare matter and bare form, but that there's this middle ground, which is hexis and energeia, which brings together the matter and the form in such a way that they're kind of indistinguishable from one another. So there are these other terms that fall under these categories. We have the patient and the agent, the dunamis and the entelecheia, which combined into kinesis, as I mentioned. But we also have phusis and nous. And between them is the psyche or the pneuma. So again, between all of these opposites, there's always a kind of middle ground that mixes the two and makes them indistinguishable. Another one would be the means and the ends. And between the means and the ends, we have something like instrumentality or maybe like self-instrumentalizing, which we'll see, like the hand, for example, instrumentalizes itself. It's not used by something, it's used by me, but it's a kind of self-instrumentalizing. It's both the means and the ends at the same time. So the classical view of hylomorphism and what people usually stop at when they try to understand Aristotle is actually what he doesn't mean, especially when he's talking about nature, life, intellect. Okay. purely within the artificial world, hylomorphism is a form imposed from outside on matter, right? I have the idea in my head, I combined it with bronze, and then I have a statue, right? The idea is the shape of the thing that it will become, and the bronze is something external to that. All right, well, let's look at what Aristotle says about bronze. He starts actually giving a far more uh, concrete and dynamic sense to hylomorphism. Now, bronze is a mixture of copper and tin, right? You take a lot of copper, small amount of tin, you add a little bit of tin, you can also use pewter and some other stuff, and you get bronze. And bronze has different qualities, right? The quality of tin and the quality of copper mixed together. The bronze becomes stronger, but tin is very brittle. Well, the copper adds, the tensile strength that tin doesn't have, but it also adds the fact that it can hold an edge in a way that copper can't, right? So there's a kind of continuity and mixture of the qualities, even though tin, according to Aristotle, is the formal element and copper the material element. I think that whether or not this has any reality in chemistry or metallurgy or whatever, it's very revealing to what he thinks psychologically about hylomorphism. So the other key passage comes from the Physics Book 2, where he says that physis is a hylomorphism. It is a mixture of matter and form, but it's not the way that people normally think about it. It's not like a statue. It's like a doctor who heals themselves. So again, I said agent and patient were similar to form and matter. So if the agent is acting on a patient, they're acting on something external to themselves. But in physis, in nature, in living things, there's this intransitive relationship. I'm not acting on something external to me, right? There's the active voice, the passive voice, and the middle voice. The active voice is transitive. The passive voice is also transitive, but it just flips the direction. But the middle voice is intransitive. So you can think, I free someone, or you say, someone frees me. And then you can say, I free myself, right? So physis is an activity of healing that heals itself intransitively, not as if it's another acting on itself. So a doctor could literally, doctor on themselves. Then they're actually acting on themselves as if they're separate. So it's an internal thing where by acting, I intensify and regulate my power of acting. And he gives the example of concoction. We can also think of effort. As I exert my effort, my power to exert that effort, my precision within that effort, my endurance in exerting that effort all grow, right? If I practice piano, I become better at playing piano and better at practicing piano, right? There's a feedback loop of agent and patient within the soul, within nature. And the last major idea, which is really central to all of this, especially the developmental temporality and all of this, is the idea of continuous proportion. Continuous proportion says A is to B as B is to C. And again, as C is to D, and you can go on forever. And a number example would be 1 is to 2, as 2 is to 4, as 4 is to 8, as 8 is to 16. This is a geometric series. Now, within the psychological sphere, we have what we might call a continuous analogy. Perception is to memory as memory is to experience, which is to say, perception is a precondition to memory. You have a perception and then you remember it. Well, you have to have memory and multiple memories in order to have experience. Experience for Aristotle means the conglomeration of many individual experiences that come together and unlock something more than any of those discrete experiences by themselves, right? And from experience, we can form knowledge. Knowledge has experience as a precondition, but it's also something more than knowledge. It goes beyond it, and wisdom goes beyond knowledge. We see this again within the moral sphere. We have habits, and those habits become character, right? Moral virtues and intellectual virtues. And once we've put these things together, then we can have friendship and happiness and things like that, right? So one stage is to the next stage as that stage is to the stage after it. And each one is to the prior as a kind of form and matter. And this involves what Merleau-Ponty and Fauti call retrieval and surpassing. So you're retrieving something from the prior stage, and yet you're surpassing it, or you're preserving some aspect of the prior stage and yet transforming it. And we can think of the Aufheben and Relevé and all of these ideas in Hegel and Derrida and other thinkers later. It is also an irreversible series, so it has that vertical genesis quality to it, that it gradually increases itself in a certain order, but with contingencies. You might never get to a certain stage. There's no guarantee. It's not a necessary thing. It's a contingent series. And for Aristotle, all series, all proportionate, continuous proportions converge in happiness. And so, with all of this misunderstanding about hylomorphism, scholars have basically completely missed the most probably important aspect of Aristotle's philosophy, which is the pneuma. So, again, between matter and form, we have energeia. But between the living body, which is composed of fire, air, water, and earth, and the psyche, which is immaterial, we have pneuma, which is this kind of ether stuff. I'm not going to get too deep into this. The book by Abraham Boss is incredible. You should definitely read it. But let me just give you a little bit about it. The pneuma it fills the body, pervades the body, it pervades the entire universe, but it isn't the parts of the universe. So it's like light and ether. So ether is in the outer sphere, light is down here, it comes from the outer sphere. And this pneuma, this spirit, goes through the entirety of the universe, but also the entirety of our bodies. And through minor expansions and contractions, micro movements, it moves the rest of the body like a pole on a boat, he says. It's like a leverage, right? You move a tiny bit, and through the machinic interrelations of the body, of the sublunar elements, the rest of the body moves. And the pneuma is in the body prior to its germinal, prior to its embryonic development. So in a way, it's an instrument of the soul, he says, that instrumentalizes itself, but it doesn't have organs. So it's an instrumental body without organs, to borrow the phrase from Deleuze, which, like the stars, immediately moves itself under its own effort and thought. As soon as it wills something, it begins moving. That doesn't mean the body will actually do what it wills it to do, but it immediately acts on the body. It has this kind of inner sense of effort and tension, and it immediately realizes itself, but then it mediates that movement through the body. It propagates that movement through the body. So the pneuma is not the same as air. It pre-exists our respiration within embryology, and connectedly, it is what causes spontaneous generation, which Aristotle also talks about. So because there's pneuma within everything in the universe, given the right circumstances, that pneuma will activate itself and spontaneously generate into like bugs. We could call it, I think we could rename Bose's book, and I would maybe write an article at some point with this title or something related. Instead of Aristotle on God's life-generating power, pneuma as its vehicle, Aristotle on the soul's cybernetic power, and the pneuma as its instrumental body without organs. And this is going to be really important as we go forward with the idea of the embryonic and a kind of intelligent power that isn't determined by a set of structures already existing, right? It's in this kind of virtual state. It's not fully actualized yet. Simondon would use the term pre-individual. Okay. We can also think of light as being an absential power, the same way that the ether and the pneuma and all of this are, and entelecheia as well. We do not see light. We see its effects. We see illumination. The same thing goes for God. He has a kind of negative theology. We don't know God's essence. We know the results of that essence, because God's essence is absential and virtual. So we do not see the entelecheia of a living being, we see the effects of that living being, right? We see all of the uh, manifestations of health. And through a focalization, we know that health is like a unified thing. Um, and we don't see the pneuma in the body. We see all these vital movements and processes going on, and they're all accounted for through the basic elements. But this pneuma is in there and making them happen. So very quickly, this is the kind of layout of the dynamic schema for Aristotle. You have dunamis, energeia, and entelecheia. And between each, you have certain things. So between actuality and potentiality, you have movement. Between enactment and complete holding itself in continuity of entelecheia, you have contemplation. And between uh, energeia and dunamis, you have another kind of activation. We can think of this as in the case of perception. So, in order to perceive, Aristotle says, and perception is an enactment, it's an energeia. We have two potentials. We have the perceptible and we have the perceiver, right? So these two potentials come together and they form an actuality and energeia together. It's the cuts across the division between the external and the internal. And we also have something similar within contemplation. But instead of something external to me moving me, right, the physical, sensible thing impinges on my eyes and my skin or whatever, and it pushes them and changes their condition. Instead, within knowledge, we have something already contained in our soul. We already have it, right? We already hold it in a complete continuity within our soul. And we're merely enacting it, right? We can think here of pure memory for Bergson, or of knowledge possessed but not being used. When we move from knowledge possessed but not used to thinking about it, contemplating it, we're not changing ourselves. We're not undergoing an evolution. We're not gaining a new ability, right? When I remember geometry, I'm not learning geometry over again, right? I'm just contemplating something I've already learned. And then between them, we have movement. So in a way, energeia and entelecheia, if we want to try and differentiate these right now, and Aristotle reconfuses them over and over again. So he doesn't want a clear distinction between them, but he wants to kind of show differences. Energeia is a participation of powers focalized in work activity. And work activity is not exactly the same as movement because you don't start as incapable of building and then end capable of building when you're in the process of building. So as a builder, you're enacting the power to build, but you're not becoming a builder in the process. You're just enacting it, right? So it's not a process of learning, which would be a movement. It's just a process of enactment. Entelecheia, on the other hand, is a non-participatory, but is participated in by others. So the light example, right? The light is not affected by being by illuminating things, and it's not changed by that. Although the medium undergoes a certain movement, and then there's illumination, and then we can see. The entelecheia of the light is not changing, and the same thing would go for the pneuma within the body. So the nous, which is pure intellect, ether, light, and pneuma, they're all really the same thing under different aspects. And we can say that on the one hand, light and nous are closer to entelecheia, and pneuma and ether are closer to energeia, being at work. So anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on this. So I think that the really important thing that we can draw from this, and in terms of biophilosophy, is that what's really important is, I mean, obviously the question of teleology is very important, but there's an early stage of the importance of this problem, which is to say, does teleology exist? Can it coexist and interact with mechanism? Things like that. What's really interesting, and I think the real core of biophilosophy needs to focus on this question, is genesis. Where does it come from? How does it created? How can purpose, information, form, value, how can they emerge and transform? And this is to focus our biophilosophy on the embryonic potentiality rather than the fully formed potentiality, or sorry, fully formed actuality. So the incomplete actuality, right? The body without organs, the embryonic for Rie. And I think some very profound questions here are things like, how is it that the embryo without a brain invents a brain, creates a brain? And even don't have to think of the embryo, you can think in terms of evolution. How is it that we can think without yet having fully formed the organs of thought? And how can we think without language such that we invent language? And this isn't just a question of like our ancient ancestors. How is it that we can invent new ways of thinking that we can't think of now because we don't have the words for it yet, right? So according to Rie, the brain and language harbor embryonic potential. They do not eliminate it by, so, when an embryo becomes a full grown organism, it has to eliminate, it cannot eliminate its heart. Like once you have a heart, if you stop having a heart, you stop living. But not all of that embryonic potential needs to go into an irreversible passage to organization and stay there, right? Within our brain, we harbor embryonic potential for further differentiation and for further organization. So let's jump to French spiritualism now. Not everybody's probably familiar with it, so I'll give a brief background on its ideas and how Aristotle and Leibniz influenced it, and then how that turns into Bergsonism. The main influences are Plotinus and Leibniz, other than Aristotle. The founder is perhaps Mandabiron, that people will say different things. And in the immediate generation before Bergson, you had Ravesson, who had this kind of developmental ontology of habit. And this guy, Foulet, and there's plenty of others, but with force ideas. So thinking of the eidetic as something that creates action and movement and change, not just like ideas floating off in the world. So ideas are forces. And this is understood through Entelecheia and what Bergson will later understand as the virtual past. So the French spiritualists were fighting reductionism in the 18th century, especially in brain science. But they were doing it in an interesting way because they were also encouraging the study of scientific studies and interdisciplinarity and what we might today call like an integral approach to education and science and understanding. And they were fascinated with these ideas from Aristotle on Entelecheia and Energeia and this because everything was being talked about in terms of functions, right? And localization of functions in the organs and in centers of the brain. But if we can shift the question from function and potential to actuality, so from potency to act, and from function to activity, we'll see that the perceived and the perception and the body as a whole cannot be looked at as just localization of a function within a specific part of the body and a mechanistic explanation thereof. The process of perceiving involves the whole body and the sensory world without a bifurcation of nature, as Whitehead calls it. And we can also see a kind of focal sense to our dynamic relationality in body and in virtue and in knowledge. And this, again, focal sense of the hexis. Hexis is the key to virtue, and virtue is where the term virtual comes from, right? Because I don't stop having a virtue just because I'm not enacting it. And it's also more than any single enactment. It's this whole multimodal expression. And from that, and the spiritualists build in this direction, we need an intuitive sense of life. If we try and build an analytic sense of life through actualization and through representation, we will have a completely mutilated and mechanized view of life. And by focusing on habit and development, they were able to draw out this metaphysics in the same way that Aristotle does. So in the history of dynamics after Aristotle, after his laying out of, first Entelecheia, second Entelecheia, first potency, second potency, we have Philoponus, who points out this ambiguity and this need for a middle ground between extremes. So On the one hand, we have bare potency, the potency for matter to be a substratum of contraries, or we can think, a newborn child has the potential to see, but hasn't yet like opened its eyes and had them fully develop and actualize sight, right? And that's always going to be different than a capacity which is restrained. So a child who has developed their sight, but then they're asleep and their eyes are closed. They're not seeing, but they're not, when they wake up and they look out into the world, they're not seeing for the first time. So also between wakefulness and sleep, there's not just an on-off switch. There's a middle ground. There's drunkenness. There's delirium. And we can also think if there's this diminution, that there's this whole latitude of deformations and tensions that slacken and tighten the soul's wakefulness and attention. There's, of course, heightened attention. And the word for attention is prosekane, which is related to entelecheia, right? As a kind of attentiveness of intellectual activity. And wakefulness will increase the continuity and participation of the soul's power, right? It will participate in more activities, more potentialities, right? As we perceive more, we're participating in more realities. And we create greater continuity by creating cohesion in our thought. Next, we have Leibniz, and he really dives into this a lot further. He picks up these terms. He uses entelechy. He uses the idea of composed and uncomposed monads to parallel the distinction between first and second entelecheia. So first entelecheia is sleep, and second entelecheia is wakefulness. First entelecheia, again, is knowledge that we have but aren't using. And on the second hand, knowledge actively contemplated, right? So in a way, what we have is entelecheia as an enduring virtuality, not present, not presently actualized, but existing, right? I mean, I'm alive while I'm sleeping, but I'm not up and moving around. And then I have the full living actuality of that. So Leibniz makes a distinction between living force, dead force, and virtual force. And the virtual force is this kind of third potential, this virtual potential standing between them. We can also think about this in relation to the integral and the differential, and the relation of the tangent and the infinitely small. So an infinitely small amount of action is going to open us to a middle path between the virtual and the actual, especially with the idea of microperceptions, right? So Bergson gives this example. You place a gram on a large scale, and the scale is not sensitive enough to measure up that difference. But it's not as if it does nothing. So just because it cannot overcome the strength of the scale just standing where it is, the scale is not sensitive enough to tally it up. It prepares a movement through accumulation. If you add 10 more grams, then all of a sudden you have a thing. And if you remove one of those, it might drop below the sensitive range. So it makes a difference even if the difference is infinitely small, right? And so this is the way that we have perceptions of the entire universe, according to Leibniz. We have a virtual perception of the entire universe. So every movement in the universe is being recorded in our monad, but not in a way that's strong enough for us to actually perceive them or apperceive them or become aware of them. I virtually perceive the entire universe, infinitely small perceptions that can't fully actualize. I have a full actualization of the perceptions that are nearby me that have overcome that force. Oh, that's supposed to disappear. So Mandelbrot takes this up into his psychology. He draws on the idea of the differential, of the infinitesimal fluxion, all of this from Leibniz, and bases all of his metaphysics and, in a way, phenomenology on force, on living force and virtual speed. And so if I'm pushing this block, but it has this tension here. I could be pushing the block at what would be, 2 miles an hour if I was just pushing it along. But because the string is holding it back, the virtual speed is 2 miles an hour, but the actual speed is 0 miles per hour, right? So there's this absential virtual aspect of the intentional aspect, right? The intentional directionality and potentiality in that moment. All right, I'm not going to dig into all of these, but it's all about this middle ground and the virtuality between them. Now, we can think here of how are we aware of something that's not actual within our perception? And a great precursor to this comes from Avicenna and the floating man, which is a famous idea that, a person without any sensory input would have a sense of their potential. They would have a sense of their capacity to sense because we have a perception of, Aristotle will say something like, we have a perception of darkness, not because we're perceiving light or perceiving a sense of sensual, we're not receiving any sense stimuli, but we perceive the darkness as the deprivation of that stimuli and our awareness that we could perceive it, right? So there's this absential virtual self-awareness. We can sense what we are capable of, and this goes beyond a mere retention of past accomplishment, beyond a mere representation or projection of a stimulation that we're not getting. And similarly, we have a sort of protension, and I'm using Husserl's term here, but a sort of projection or sort of anticipation of what we might be capable of in development and transformation, right? We can't know what that is. If I want to become something new, right? If I want to reinvent myself and become an artist or something like that, or become a writer, become a philosopher, I can't know exactly what that's going to be, but I can know it well enough in order to pursue it. And in the process, I will not only realize it, I will also undergo discernment and create the goal that becomes who I become. So we have this awareness of a future possibility, but it's not an actualization and it's not something finite. It's this virtual, multiple potentiality. And really, we are in a situation of needing to invent our powers. We want to go beyond where we are. Phenomenology is one of these things that transforms us in the process. Who we started out as and who we end as are different. The same with Platonic philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy. We must surpass our prior states and create something new, create new powers of acting in a continuous proportion. As we move forward, like in similar when you're looking through your memories, you get to a certain place and you notice new horizons of possibilities open. Well, what new future possible horizons will we carry with us as we surpass our current self and open up into new potentials that we don't currently have, right? We find our new values and aspiration, then we will set ourselves new goals that we can't currently understand or think about. So in cybernetics and biophilosophy, the goal is always automation. In a way, Fourier says that cybernetics is this kind of almost, you would say, like fascistic approach to automation. We must automate everything for the sake of automation itself. All means necessary towards the goal of the furthering of automation. What it does is it replaces work activity, right? Effort and intelligently guided effort with automated systems. But this can only ever fulfill a need already determined, right? You cannot automate the creation of new goals. um, unless it's just freewheeling in its own machinic way that will likely destroy itself. And this brings us the homunculus problem, which Deakin and Rie and a number of others point out that ultimately uh, the meaning, the purpose, the effort cannot be automated. That you cannot ever do away entirely with the pre-actualized impetus, the desire, the embryonic potentiality, the virtual uh, apprehension of the purpose and interconnectedness of things. So cybernetics ends up being a necessary developmental stage in biophilosophy. I don't think that, so I hear people all the time talk about, cybernetics is just this, absolute mechanizing of everything. No, it's not. and there are cyberneticists today who use that term for themselves because they realize you can't get rid of cybernetics. You can't get rid of the need to regulate and to control things. Now, we can have more sophisticated wisdom about life that is not about controlling, right? And it's not about dominating, and it's not about externally imposing a form on matter or something like that. Well, that doesn't get you out of the need to direct and regulate and move about in the world.